Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism and Literature. In today's session, in continuation with our discussion of Lyotard's text, The Postmodern Condition, we shall be looking at how Lyotard intervenes in a culture driven by grand narratives and also how he challenges the ideology of the predominant regime, which also monopolizes knowledge. In the course of his discussion, having laid out the context for the need to talk about a postmodern condition in advanced societies, particularly the computerized societies, Lyotard says, "This is what the postmodern world is all about. Most people have lost the nostalgia for the lost narrative. It in no way follows that they are reduced to barbarity. What saves them from it is their knowledge that legitimation can only spring from their own linguistic practice and communicational interaction. Science, smiling into its beard at every other belief, has taught them the harsh austerity of realism." So, at multiple levels, Lyotard's discussion is also a historical understanding of the postmodern condition, where he locates postmodernism as a departure from the methods of realism and also from the methods and the ideas celebrated by modernity and modernism. To recall some of the premises that Lyotard talks about, the postmodern condition is the study of the status of knowledge in advanced computerized societies. He also reminds us that this is a term, the postmodern is a term which is being currently used in the 1970s in the Western context. And he also talks about the technical and technological advancements since the Second World War and how they all had a radical effect on the status of knowledge in advanced societies, and he particularly draws our attention to the process of computerization. And here he chooses to focus on one particular problem, one variable in the status of knowledge, which is that of legitimation, and how Lyotard differs in his approach towards the idea of legitimation from that of Habermas, who spoke about the crisis of legitimation, is something that we shall be taking a look at towards the end of this lecture. And in the course of his discussion, Lyotard also reminds us that there is a connection between the knowledge and power. And this is also a question of a hierarchical relationship, where in which there are two questions which emerge as very pertinent. One, who decides what knowledge is? And secondly, who questions what needs to be decided? And even when we set out to seek an answer for these questions, we also realize that the question of knowledge is intimately connected to the question of government. So there is a very different kind of relationship which gets established over here in the postmodern condition, where knowledge gets quite intimately connected with the systems of government. So knowledge also moves beyond the realm of truth, beyond the realm of seeking truth, and it moves into a question of government, where it's also under particular kinds of governances and particular kinds of control. And Lyotard does not talk about knowledge in a very general term. He focuses on one particular thing, which is science. He reminds us how science is tightly interwoven with government and administration in the information age, in the computerized age. And there's also a reason that he provides for this. It's also because enormous amounts of capital and installations are needed for research in the contemporary, in the information age, in the computerized age. And this particularly is a problem, as he points out right at the outset of the essay, a problem that is fraught within modern advanced societies which are also computerized. And this leads us to this question: what exactly is legitimate knowledge? And he also gives us an example of digital databases, quoting the example from IBM, which we shall be shortly taking a look at. And he while talking about digital databases, he asks, who decides what knowledge is worth storing? Who has access? Who will determine what kind of data is forbidden? Is it the state, or is the state reduced to being just one among the many users? And these are some of the questions Lyotard tells us that we need to engage with in the postmodern condition, because the idea of knowledge, the idea of control over information, control over knowledge has radically changed. And it is not just about a person or a set of people pursuing the idea of truth, but it has also been part of governments and big corporate agencies. And he gives this example of IBM when he talks about suppose, for example, that a firm such as IBM is authorized to occupy a belt in the Earth's orbital field and launch communications satellites or satellites housing data banks. Who will have the access to them? who will determine which channels or data are forbidden? The state, or will the state simply be one user among others? New legal issues will be raised. So this is something extremely important that we need to pay attention to in the postmodern age. When the systems of knowledge, the systems of hierarchies change, there are also new questions and new challenges being posed, leading us to a particular need to engage with novel legal questions and novel ways of engaging with particular problems and finding solutions. This entire process Lyotard undertakes through a particular method of investigation, and that is primarily through language games. And here is where we find a very typical postmodern mind at work when we read Lyotard's the postmodern condition. He is bringing in the methods, he's bringing in concepts and aspects from various disciplines, and he's bringing them together to engage with the idea, the contrasting and the paradoxical ideas of postmodernism. And here he talks about developments in postmodernity, and he shows us how these developments are largely concerned with language. In his own words, it is fair to say that for the last 40 years, the leading sciences and technologies have had to do with language, phonology, and theories of linguistics, problems of communication and cybernetics, modern theories of algebra and informatics, computers and their languages, problems of translation and the search for areas of compatibility among computer languages, problems of information storage and data banks, so on and so forth. And here, something needs to be highlighted with a particular focus, that language ceases to be understood in a very conventional sense. It also becomes a kind of development that the postmodern societies are more concerned about. Here Lyotard is also making a very unconventional comparison across disciplines such as linguistics, philosophy, and also the technology and the sciences. There are three observations that Lyotard goes on to make in terms of the language games. Firstly, the rules of language games do not carry with them their own legitimation. Secondly, if there are no rules, there is no game, and moves or utterances that do not follow rules are not part of the particular game. Thirdly, every utterance is a move in a game. And this needs to be read in continuation with one of the first things that Lyotard talks about in his work, that postmodernism is also something that alters the game rules of every discipline in the contemporary. And here, with the mixing of philosophy with concepts and methods from other disciplines, he's also displaying a very characteristic trait of postmodernism in his very own approach, in his very own method of investigation into the postmodern condition. And there are various implications which are connected with these identifications of language games with the development of postmodernity. One of those include the examination of the political and epistemological aspects of knowledge, which Lyotard also seeks to undertake in this work. He also then illustrates how the nature of the social bond also has changed, because as and when the nature of knowledge changes, as and when the games, as and when the language games associated with doing science changes, because as and when the language rules associated with various aspects of knowledge undergo a change, social bond also undergoes a radical change, because social bond is also composed of language moves. Though Lyotard talks at length in determining how the language rules are at work and how these games play a very determinant role in identifying particular kinds of knowledge systems and also the underlying hierarchies, he also then leads us to the major point of his discussion, which is also what is at stake in the character of modern science. Even when the discussion pertains to rather broad and loose areas such as knowledge and language games and the general idea of postmodernity in the contemporary, Lyotard always narrows down the discussion to the character of modern science, and this is also something that he identifies as being at stake in the postmodern age, under the postmodern condition, under the changing systems of knowledge in the computerized societies. And here he also seeks to make a distinction between two kinds of knowledge, which is narrative knowledge and scientific knowledge. And this distinction is based on the kind of legitimation that both of these systems of knowledge seek. And in the case of narrative knowledge, there is no recourse to legitimation. On the other hand, scientific knowledge seeks legitimation by scientific criteria. So there are these two systems which he identifies, and the distinction of one from the other is made on the basis of what kind of legitimation is required, what kind of legitimation is needed or not needed. And here in this process, Lyotard also reminds us how eventually the dominance of scientific knowledge over narrative knowledge has also become the order of the day, especially with the wake of modernity. The promise of progress that modernity had provided to the modern world was also an offshoot of the dominance of scientific knowledge over narrative knowledge. So in some sense, we can even, it would not be wrong to say that Lyotard's work could be seen as a defense of narrative knowledge from the increasing dominance of scientific knowledge. There are a number of critics who've had a problem with this kind of distinction and also with the kind of premises that Lyotard had put forward. But nevertheless, it also becomes quite seminal in the understanding of the postmodern condition, especially since the binaries were drawn and promoted from the modernist period onwards. Lyotard's text also gives us a very brief pointer towards how in modernity the narrative of science was legitimated by a number of meta-narratives, primarily the Hegelian and the Marxist frameworks. And here it's useful to recall time and again how the incredulity toward meta-narratives become useful in talking about the various ways in which the postmodern period departs from the modernist period. And if post-modernity celebrates the end of meta-narratives, if we are called to display an incredulity toward meta-narratives, what legitimates science now? And this is a question that dominates most of the discussions in the latter part of Lyotard's work. And given that science is a system of knowledge which always seeks some kind of legitimation or the other, it becomes imperative to identify a new system of legitimation once the meta-narratives are put to an end, once the meta-narratives are displaced, once a distrust towards the meta-narratives have been developed. And the answer Lyotard gives is performativity. And performativity in that sense becomes a technological criteria for legitimating science, legitimating the various activities which are labeled as science. And interestingly, there is a crisis which is inherent in this act of performativity. Once we identify a different kind of legitimation process rooted in performativity with respect to science, there is a crisis which is inherent in it. Because legitimation by performativity, according to Lyotard, it is against the interests of research. Here it's important to note that Lyotard is not prioritizing the element of truth, the truth value which is associated with the disciplines of science. He is not trying to invoke the meta-narratives of modernity to legitimate research either. On the other hand, he is trying to see the role of research as a production of ideas. And he also feels that when one privileges performativity as one of the modes of legitimating a science, it's also in some form or the other marring this various kinds of productions of ideas, because performativity terrorizes the production of ideas. So it does not become a fruitful method, a fruitful kind of legitimation in after the meta-narratives have been displaced. The alternative, Lyotard says, lies in paralogy. Para means beyond, and paralogy in that sense means beyond or against an established way of reasoning. So by calling to move beyond the ideas of beyond the traditional ideas of reason, Lyotard is arguing that the alternate legitimating method for science perhaps lies in moving beyond all kinds of rational and reason-based activities associated with science. And herein, it's in this context that Lyotard also associates postmodern science with the search for instabilities. And he says there are certain advantages for identifying, for locating an alternative in paralogy, because it also satisfies the desire for justice and also the desire for the unknown. And Lyotard's believe the perfect kind of doing science is perhaps a coming together of the desire for justice and also the desire for unknown, without privileging one over the other. And the advantages of paralogy also ties up very well with the incredulity towards metanarratives that Lyotard talks about right at the outset of his work. And this, he also feels, would lead to the emergence of the possibility of the emergence of new and hybrid disciplines. Performativity, since it will terrorize the production of ideas, will not encourage the encourage newer possibilities, encourage the emergence of hybrid disciplines. And this happens because there is no connection to the old epistemic traditions, because paralogy is beyond reason, beyond all established conventions of reason, and hence it is not bound to work according to the old epistemic traditions, and there is more freedom available over here, and there is also more hybrid ways of engaging and producing ideas. As a corollary to the various discussions about legitimating science, legitimating various systems of knowledge, Lyotard then focuses on the current perception of knowledge as a commodity, as a saleable commodity. Because the production of knowledge in the postmodern age in computerized advanced society, this is no longer considered as an aspiration to truth. And there has also been a market shift in that sense from whether it is true or not towards how useful it is. Is it useful or not? So this use value, which could also be seen perhaps in parallel with the idea of performativity in legitimating science, this idea of use value becomes also one of the parameters of judging or valuing knowledge. And here we also find that the emphasis of knowledge has shifted from the ends of human action to its means, and this is something that he associates very strictly with the postmodern age, with the postmodern condition, and this is certainly a departure from the modernist ideas and from the ideologies related to modernity. And in his own words, knowledge in the form of an informational commodity indispensable to productive power is already and will continue to be a major, perhaps the major stake in the worldwide competition for power. It is conceivable that the nation states will one day fight for control of information, just as they battled in the past for control over territory, and afterwards for control of access to and exploitation of raw materials and cheap labor. So here he is not discounting the possibility of a nation states waging wars with one another for fight for control of information. This nexus that Lyotard identifies between knowledge and power does have very serious implications for the future of the world. And this is also because knowledge is being increasingly identified with the various elements of control. Production of knowledge is increasingly being influenced by a technological model. Just like during the Industrial Revolution, knowledge entered the economic equation and became a force for production for the first time, in the postmodern age, in the age of postmodernity, we find that knowledge becomes a central force for production. It also becomes an economic factor, and in that sense, control of information is not just a matter of power, it's not just a matter of control of knowledge, it's also a matter related to the economy of the of various nation states. And here there is a kind of relationship that Lyotard identifies in the postmodern period between knowledge and power, the various forms of exercising control, and eventually how all of this is connected to the economic factor as well. This sort of seemingly bizarre connection that Lyotard makes in the late 1970s, interestingly, it has become almost like the order of the day a few decades from then, and now it no longer seems as an impossible kind of a proposition when we go back to Lyotard and look at the various ways in which he talks about knowledge, power, control, and the economic factors associated with it. He also draws our attention to how knowledge has been reduced to particular kinds of skills and also the kind of training attributed in relation to that. In his own words, knowledge will no longer be transmitted en bloc once and for all to young people before they entry into workforce. Rather, it is and will be served a la carte to adults who are either already working or expect to be for the purpose of improving their skills and chances of promotion, but also to help them acquire information, languages, and language games, allowing them both to widen their occupational horizons and to articulate their technical and ethical experience. The kind of functions knowledge had within a university space, the kind of transmission that knowledge had within a university space, within particular kinds of departments and institutions, have also begun to undergo a radical change. This is something that we can relate with in a better way, looking back at Lyotard from the contemporary. The English translation, the English version of Postmodern Condition, which came out in 1984, also had an appendix titled What is Postmodernism? And here Lyotard also talks essentially about the importance of avant-garde art and tells us how modern art presents the unpresentable as a missing content within a beautiful form, whereas postmodern art puts forward the unpresentable by foregoing beautiful form itself, denying the consensus of taste in Kantian terms. And he also gives the example of Marcel Proust and James Joyce as examples of postmodern art. And in this appendix, What is Postmodernism, he's also drawing a parallel across various kinds of science and also the idea of avant-garde art. And in his own words, those are ideas which no presentation is possible. Therefore, they impart no knowledge about reality or experience. They also prevent the free union of the faculties which give rise to the sentiment of the beautiful. And they present the formation and the stabilization of taste. They can be said to be unpresentable. So in some sense, Lyotard's work is a celebration of the displacement of the metanarratives, and also in terms of art, a celebration of the presentation of unpresentable ideas. So unlike the modernist form of art in which the unpresentable was seen as a lack, unlike the modernist times, in the postmodern times, the presentation of the unpresentable seems to require no particular form, and there is also no burden of reality which is being imposed onto this presentation of the unpresentable. And in this context, it's also important to very briefly take a look at the idea of legitimation, which Habermas presented in 1973. Many critics have pointed out that Lyotard's work could be read in opposition to Habermas' ideas of legitimation. Habermas spoke about legitimation as a series of crisis tendencies within capitalist societies, and he also illustrated how these different kinds of crises make it impossible to maintain political stability through consent alone. And the focus of his work was on the contradictions and conflicts between the logic of capitalist accumulation and the popular pressures that democratic politics unleashes on the other. In other words, it was about the pursuit of profit versus demands of social welfare and equality, which in turn also challenged the stability of particular nation states. So in that sense, Habermas located the absence of legitimation, the challenges upon legitimation, as a crisis, as something that needs to be resolved, much in contradiction to what later Lyotard writes about. So based on these contrastive ideas, a number of works have been published where researchers have where theorists have tried to locate the differences, the points of departure between Habermas and Lyotard on postmodernity. And one of the most quoted essays in this aspect is Richard Rorty's 1985 essay, Habermas and Lyotard on Postmodernity. And Habermas also has written an essay in 1981 titled Modernity versus Postmodernity, which also had an alternate title, Modernity, an Incomplete Project. Quite often, they're not in the context of Lyotard's definition of the postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. The idea is proposed by Habermas about modernity being an incomplete project has been discussed. And in this essay, Modernity versus Postmodernity, Habermas begins to give an example and illustration from the contemporary times, and he talks about how postmodernity presents itself as anti-modernity. And with this statement of negation, he goes on to define the term modern in a historical and intellectual context. He talks about the various kinds of definitions attributed to the term modern, including the romantic notion of the modern, including the Enlightenment idea of the modern. He continues to situate the term modern with a focus on the changing definitions and the changing scheme of things, and eventually he begins to talk about the discipline of aesthetic modernity, and with quoting the example of Baudelaire. And in this context, he also engages with the term avant-garde and says, the avant-garde understands itself as invading unknown territory, exposing itself to the dangers of sudden, of shocking encounters, conquering an as yet unoccupied future. The avant-garde must find a direction in a landscape into which no one seems to have yet ventured. And he continues to and dwelling upon the idea of the avant-garde as in continuation with an illustration that he began talking about in the beginning of the essay, where he also talks about how certain avant-garde projects are also manifesting a number of anti-modern qualities, and he continues to dwell upon the idea of the avant-garde and draws our attention to what is the meaning of this failure. Does it signal a farewell to modernity? And here Habermas also shows his discomfort in moving away from the idea of modernity, because according to him the project of modernity is not yet finished. Thinking more generally, does the existence of a post-avant-garde mean there is a transition to that broader phenomenon called postmodernity? So just because a particular kinds of movements are there, particular kinds of art forms are there, calling in for the need to be labeled them as avant-garde, Habermas is asking whether there is a need to move beyond modernity, whether there's a need to signal a farewell to modernity and move to the broader aspect, the broader phenomenon called postmodernity. And he rather categorically then states, I think that instead of giving up modernity and its project as a lost cause, we should learn from the mistakes of those extravagant programs which have tried to negate modernity. Perhaps the types of reception of art may offer an example which at least indicates the direction of a way out. And he talks about at least two different ways in which one could begin to talk about alternatives when one begins to move away from the project of modernity. And certainly for Habermas, giving up on modernity is not the only option, and there could be other alternatives that one could figure out by engaging with avant-garde art which has departed from the idea of modernity in some form or the other. And here we also wonder whether Habermas is directly in conversation with Lyotard when he says, according to one thesis, science, when properly understood, has become irrevocably meaningless for the orientation of the life world. A further thesis is that politics must be kept as far aloof as possible from the demands of moral, practical justification. And a third thesis asserts that the pure immanence of art disputes that it has a utopian content and points to its illusory character in order to limit the aesthetic experience to privacy. And he also, towards the end of his essay, says, but with the decisive confinement of science, morality and art to autonomous spheres separated from the life world and administered by experts, what remains from the project of cultural modernity is only what we could have if we were to give up the project of modernity altogether. So throughout this essay, we also get this impression that Habermas is not in favor of giving up on the project of modernity, but he calls in for a need to engage with alternatives rather than moving into the broader area of postmodernity, which he also thinks is a stance of anti-modernity without giving the fair chance which was accorded to modernity in the first place. But irrespective of the various kinds of discussions that one could continue to have on the incredulity toward metanarratives and also the crisis of legitimation, Lyotard, perhaps we could say, has the last word over here, and he continues to call for a break with the tradition of the modern, because also trying to read Lyotard's and Habermas' work together, we can also find Lyotard's opposition to the Habermas ideas when he says, the modern project of realizing universality has not been abandoned or forgotten, but destroyed, liquidated. So unlike what Habermas proposes to give some more time for the project of modernity to get completed, rather than moving away, rather than entirely abandoning it to wait for the project of modernity to reach its completion, Lyotard feels that nobody had abandoned or forgotten the project, but by itself it got destroyed and liquidated. So there is an inevitability to move towards the postmodern condition, because the sciences, the systems of knowledge has already begun to do so, and there is no going back from these computerized systems of knowledge, from these kinds of governances, with these kinds of control over information which has taken over in the advanced societies. And Lyotard's work ends with this note: let us wage a war on totality. Let us be witnesses to the unpresentable. Let us activate the differences and save the honor of the name. So this is something very important. The last word that Lyotard has over here is very important, because in the continuing discussions about postmodernism and the various manifestations of postmodernism in different forms of arts, texts and other contexts, we would see that there is a war which is being waged on the ideas of totality, on the claims of totalizing explanations and experiences, and also there is a tendency to present the unpresentable, tendency to celebrate and record and document the unpresentable, and also to activate the differences and engage with them rather than ignoring them or overlooking them. So to sum up in today's lecture, we have taken a look at the ways in which Lyotard talks about the changing notions of knowledge, especially in the context of incredulity toward meta-narratives, and we've also seen how he departs from the other ideas of legitimation put forward by Habermas, and also the other notions about the departure from modernity that Habermas and other critics talk about. And this also, I believe, has laid a foundation to talk about the other critics of postmodernism from the next lecture onwards. And in the next session, we shall be engaging with the ideas of hyperreality put forward by Baudrillard. We shall also be taking a look at how there is a continuity could be built in these various discussions in the context of postmodernism, articulated by different theorists from different disciplinary paradigms. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.